Hi everyone, welcome back to A Little More Inspired. My name is Blanca. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit the follow and subscribe button so that you never miss any of my new episodes. And if you haven't done so already, go check out my website, alittle.moreinspired.com, so that you can explore all of my content. I am very excited to be sitting down and recording a new episode. I am continuing or really starting a series on the book The Interior Castle by St. Teresa of Ávila. It is a really beautiful book that I feel like has changed my life. I feel like it's given me a lot of clarity on my spirituality, on my path. St. Teresa of Ávila has turned into one of my favorite saints. I have a few episodes that I've done on her already, so please go check those out. I will say that when I was taking notes for the mansion that I will be going into today, I felt like the first few episodes that I did on her, I was still really getting to know her as a person. I realized just like how much I've grown since the first time I read this book. So on this first episode, I'm going to be giving an intro on what the mansions are, how to grow through the beginning stages of spiritual growth, and what Christian mysticism really is. I also am pairing The Interior Castle with the second book that I grabbed the other day at the Basilica bookstore. It's called The Devil in the Castle, St. Teresa of Avila's Spiritual Warfare and the Progress of the Soul. Obviously, St. Teresa does an amazing job at explaining the soulful obstacles that the individual is going to go through as they seek to grow spiritually. But I thought it was nice to read the second book. You'll see the references of this book on the second half. So yeah, I hope that you enjoy this series. I just want to say that I am learning with you. This is just a really fun creative outlet for me. So I definitely don't claim to be an expert in the spiritual progress, but I will say that I am actively trying to grow spiritually. And I've prayed to God, if this is something that is good for me, for my soul and for others, and that maybe I'm inspiring other people to grow spiritually as well, then to continue to inspire me to make these, even if it's one person out there. So I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, let's get into it. So if you want to know a little bit more about who St. Teresa is, I have an episode already where I could dive into her biography and who she was as a person. But she is a nun from the 1500s. She originates from Spain. She is a Christian mystic. If you have never heard of the word Christian mystic, I hadn't either, honestly, until I was introduced to St. Teresa of Avila. I really like her because she is so honest and so real in her words. Her style of writing is very authentic and humble. She explains what Christian mysticism is from a very knowledgeable place. A lot of the things that she was writing about could have been perceived negatively back in the day when she was writing about them. So I think that she's really brave for writing about the topics that she wrote about. She is a doctor of the Christian Catholic Church along with John of the Cross. They're both very amazing spiritual teachers that really helped each other explain what the soul would be going through as it seeked to be closer to God. So at its core, our faith isn't just about arguments or theological precision. It's about an actual living connection with an invisible God, a relationship that goes beyond what our minds could fully grasp. This is the world of Christian mysticism. Christian mysticism is the pursuit of experiencing God directly, having a one-on-one relationship with God. It's not just about knowing Him intellectually, but encountering Him in a very deep and personal way. Mystics describe this as an intimate relationship with God. One of my goals for this creative outlet is to focus on this, on what St. Teresa of Avila is talking about, that one-on-one relationship with God. On the internet right now, there are so many different outlets for Christianity, Catholicism, spirituality, New Age, traditional. There's a lot of people always like arguing about who has the right way of thinking about things spiritually. I think that sometimes we lose sight of the deeper purpose of why we're seeking a spiritual life, right? And that's to have a direct relationship with Christ and to be able to grow internally as people. Then one day, as you're living your life and you're in the world, for some of us, there's this feeling of emptiness, and you start to become curious of something bigger than yourself. Sometimes this curiosity begins quietly. It can be subtle awareness of God's presence or a gentle nudge from the Holy Spirit. Other times, the curiosity of God takes on more extraordinary forms, such as visions, revelations, mystical experiences, such as the ones that St. Teresa of Ávila and many other saints had. As we grow and we learn about the things that St. Teresa is talking about, it's important that we don't dismiss these stronger aspects of our faith. We risk missing something essential, a faith that is not only understood but is encountered. A lot of the things that we're going to be learning from St. Teresa of Avila are direct experiences that she had from encountering God directly. St. Teresa of Avila is somebody that grew up very spiritual. She comes from a religious family. Her parents were able to implement a very deep faith within her. The way that her parents exemplified these virtues is clearly seen in St. Teresa's desire for a spiritual life when she was just a girl. In her later years, began to experience moments of profound connection with God. She described these moments as mystical experiences. Through these experiences, she was able to identify different stages of prayer, which is really what this book is about. It is about deepening prayer and the reactions that our soul will have to us growing in this practice. Some of the stages that she identified are recollection, quiet, union, and beyond. Each stage represented deeper spiritual growth. The image of the interior castle. St. Teresa begins her book with a powerful image. She describes the human soul as this magnificent castle made of a single diamond. Inside the crystal, like castles, are many rooms, each leading to the next. She divided the castle into 7 mansions, representing the stages of spiritual growth. These stages move from the early steps of faith all the way to the final mansion, where the soul is fully united with God. St. Teresa writes, "In the center of the heart of it all lies the principal chamber where God and the soul share the most intimate communion." According to St. Teresa, prayer is the key to entering the castle within ourselves and discovering the gift that God has placed in each room. So there are 2 main categories of the 7 mansions. St. Teresa groups the mansions into 2 main types of prayer. These focus on discursive prayer. Discursive prayer is prayer that involves thinking, reflection, meditation, and actively engaging the mind. In the early stages, the soul is actively working to growing closer to God. This is really the overcompassing idea of mansion 1, 2, and 3. The last 4 mansions are focused on infused prayer. Infused prayer is a deeper and more passive experience of God's presence. Instead of the soul actively thinking and meditating, God begins to take the lead in drawing the soul deeper. Beginning the journey outside the castle. This is where most of us are going to be, right? At the beginning, before we begin to seek any kind of spiritual knowledge. Teresa says everyone begins their journey outside of the castle. Many people are completely unaware that they even have a soul to enter into. A lot of people are walking around just completely unaware of themselves, unaware of the bigger picture of why we're here. They're just in the world, living their everyday life, distracted, and seems normal to everybody because it pretty much is at this point, right? Like, not a lot of people have any thought or desire to want to go within. Not a lot of people think that there's anything to cultivate within themselves. But through discursive prayer, people begin to move inward. Through that curiosity, through that feeling that there's something missing, the person begins to ask deeper questions to themselves. So, discursive prayer means actively thinking about God, often with the help of spiritual reading, meditation, and reflection. Through this effort, the soul begins moving through the first mansion. When you are beginning to grow spiritually, it begins with that curiosity, like seeking out books that expand your mind. This part really requires a lot of effort from us as individuals. The author who writes the introduction to this book quoted Padre Pio, and he says, "Through the study of books, one seeks God, but by meditation, one finds him." So I think that as you're growing spiritually, you have to be expanding your mind. You have to be growing intellectually in some kind of capacity. And I will say is that I don't think that when I started my spiritual journey, I would have been able to read this book by Saint Teresa of Avila. But I think that if you're coming from like a very authentic place of wanting to grow, sometimes you just don't have the capacity to understand some of these things yet. Sometimes your spiritual journey does start off with new age spirituality because that's where you're at right now. That's the level of spirituality your mind can honestly handle at the moment. I don't think that I would have been able to understand this book when I first began my spiritual journey in my 20s. I think that it took a lot of growing and a lot of understanding things in a different way for me to now be able to understand what Saint Teresa is even talking about. And reading her book this year, now as I prepared for this episode, I feel like I'm in such a different mindset and I've grown so much. So yeah, I think that it's important to not judge people for where they are spiritually. I think that it's important to pray for them, that truth finally is revealed to them as they grow in maturity. In these early stages, spiritual growth is largely dependent on effort. It depends on how much time and energy a person chooses to put into prayer. These first few mansions as you're growing is about the amount of effort that you're putting in. This requires discipline, commitment, and intentional prayer to help the soul move deeper into the castle. Unlike the earlier stages, where progress is largely a matter of discipline and choice, these deeper levels of prayer only occur when God chooses to draw the soul further in. This kind of prayer is called infused prayer or contemplation. This means it is less something you do and more something that is done to you. This is for like those really deep spiritual people that are totally immersed in their spiritual discipline. That doesn't mean that people who are in those mansions are not at risk of temptations and of falling and of pride, but these are people that have really, in some ways, like already mastered the first three. As St. Teresa introduces the fourth mansion, she explains something very important. In order to make rapid progress and reach the mansion we aspire to enter, it is not so essential to think much as it is to love much. In other words, spiritual progress is not primarily about intellectual effort. It is about love and how love is growing within us. So, some mystical experiences. The contemplative experiences that St. Teresa describes can sound unusual to anyone of modern day time, especially if you're just learning about Christian mysticism, because she speaks about things like raptures, spiritual ecstasies, visions. If these sound unbelievable, it's worth remembering that many of her own peers and superiors initially found them difficult to believe as well. At first, some people doubted her experiences because they sounded kind of crazy. But over time, those around her came to trust what she was experiencing. Definitely recommend getting St. Teresa of Avila's The Interior Castle. I read two of these, and I was first reading it. I read one of the original translated versions, and I liked it, but that one was a little hard to read because they were literally translating everything. This book is translating everything too, but this one has more modern language to it. And I think that they like condense some of her like sometimes Saint Teresa of Avila, I feel like she goes on these like self-deprecating rants, and I feel like they minimize that in this version here. What makes Saint Teresa so compelling really is her humility and her practicality. her perspective reassures us that she was more holy than hysterical. She constantly warns against seeking mystical experiences for their own sake. I think that, there is a lot of people growing and wanting to have these really mystical experiences, especially modern day New Age spirituality. And I really like that Saint Teresa is very rational in her explanations of seeking spiritual growth. She reminds readers that mystical experiences are not something we can achieve by effort, that these are gifts that come from God alone, and anything that you're seeking out, it really just should be through your reading, through your meditations, through your alone time. Like, this isn't something that you should be going out into the world trying to experience on your own. God will give you those things if He sees it is necessary for your spiritual growth. Just because we haven't experienced it one on one doesn't mean that God doesn't have the capacity to truly allow those experiences to happen. Why Saint Teresa's mystical experiences are so, or even like Padre Pio, when I was reading about him, things that he went through with the stigmatas. Like, this is just kind of random, but when my first job in San Diego, I worked for a construction company as a admin person, and I was working on this project for this billionaire preacher who claimed to have a lot of mystical experiences. The project that I was assigned to at the time, he was making a hotel resort kind of thing for his followers. And he was also making a museum about himself where he described all of these mystical experiences that he had encountered. And I remember thinking, like, how do people believe any of this crazy stuff? And when I read the things that Saint Teresa or Padre Pio went to, I'm like, this guy was using everything for vainglory, while Saint Teresa and Padre Pio, they never asked anybody for money. If anything, they were really afraid of sharing these mystical experiences because they knew the repercussions of the opinions people would have. And they actually found these experiences almost burdensome in their lives. And they never used anything that came into their life, any kind of money or monetary thing, for their self-interest. It was always put back into their communities. It was never something that they were doing to create fame or following of, like, look at how amazing I am. That's the difference, is that it'll be from a very humble place. So, yeah, discernment of spiritual experiences. Teresa also offers practical guidance for discernment. She explains how to distinguish whether a spiritual experience is actually coming from God, our own imagination, or even from something darker. This makes her teachings grounded and responsible rather than sensational. Because A, she was born during the Spanish Inquisition, which is when the Spanish were murdering anybody who wasn't Catholic. And any mystical thing that was seen as witchery was deeply dangerous and frowned upon. Like, if the things that she was experiencing were with the purpose of manipulation, she could have had a really terrible ending. But eventually, people saw how genuine she was, and then they started to ask her to write about her experiences. All of the books that she wrote were not books that came out of her own desire, but was something that was being really asked of her by her peers. I hope that that made sense. But the ultimate purpose of what she is talking about in her books and the purpose of prayer, she brings everything back to the greatest commandment, which is love for God and love for others. When they asked Jesus in the Bible, like, what are the two greatest commandments, is to love God, to grow our relationship with God. But he also says that the second greatest commandment is love for others, and the way that we grow with people in harmony and the relationships that we have, loving people as we love ourselves. She teaches that this is the ultimate purpose of prayer and the spiritual growth. This is the purpose of our union with God. This is what we're here for, is to be able to love other people and to be able to grow spiritually with God and to have Him involved in everything that we do in our lives. Deep union with God is not about the experience itself. It is about what that experience inspires us to do, to love God more deeply and to love others more generously. Why the interior castle is a spiritual classic? It is because it is this combination of spiritual experience, humility, and practical wisdom that makes the interior castle such a timeless spiritual classic. St. Teresa reminds us that it is good to know that God gives these kinds of gifts, even if He does not give them to everyone. So, as we approach Teresa's work, Teresa's writings are unlike anything many people have ever read. As I was growing spiritually a few years prior, I saw a lot of inspiration. For example, like Eckhart Tolle, the first book I ever read about him is called The Power of Now. And I remember thinking when I first read that book, wow, this book is so amazing. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And in the book, he references a dark night of the soul. I remember thinking the concept of a dark night of the soul was so fascinating. It gave me a lot of clarity of the emptiness that you feel when you're very far from God or from that awareness of the now. And I realized that that reference of the dark night of the soul is actually a Catholic reference. It comes from John of the Cross, which was a peer of Saint Teresa, and they really inspired each other's work. Reading now, after beginning with The Power of Now and like years later reading St. Teresa of Avila, is that a lot of these spiritual teachers, sometimes you think that they're writing these like new ways of thinking, but they're really actually really old concepts, and everyone's really just repeating things that have been passed down for many generations. And as I read more about St. Teresa of Avila, I understand that she is talking about the spiritual awakening in the first mansion. A lot of the things that you read at first with her, it may feel overwhelming, but no matter where you are in the spiritual journey, there is so much to take away from what it is that she's talking about. One helpful way to read her work is to think of it like you're mining for treasure. Perhaps it will inspire you to grow spiritually. Perhaps it will reassure you that even the most devoted people experience spiritual ups and downs. Or perhaps more importantly, it will help you see the incredible beauty and worth of the human soul. Within each of us is an eternal radiant diamond. And what the goal is to become aware of that deep, beautiful jewel that is within all of us. The interior castle really is a love story. The king of the castle is drawing his beloved into his world. God is drawing us into him. He calls the soul away from the distractions of life and invites us inward, deeper and deeper into the castle, into the innermost depths of the soul, where he alone is waiting. That is what the goal of the interior castle is a written verbal description of that experience of growing more deeper into our relationship with God. So the analogy of the soul as a castle. Saint Teresa begins with the analogy of the soul as a castle. She describes the soul as a magnificent castle made of a single diamond, or a very beautiful, transparent crystal with many rooms inside, just as heaven has many mansions. I don't know if you guys have ever read Dante's Inferno. That book describes all the different mansions of like hell, but then the author also writes a book about all the mansions that are in heaven. There's like this guy on YouTube that I really like. He has a lot of weird YouTube videos, but he also is like a religious guy, and I really like his videos on how he describes religious books. He's just like very charismatic, and I feel like his videos inspire me a lot. So I'm gonna link that if you guys wanna read that, because I feel like she is referencing that book when she makes that quote. So the true nature of the soul. Teresa wants us to understand something fundamental about the soul. Your soul is not small, mediocre, dark, or cloudy, or barely surviving. Your soul is magnificent, luminous, spiritually ordered, and intentionally designed by God. Why St. Teresa uses the image of the diamond. Teresa specifically describes the soul as a diamond. The image is very meaningful because diamonds reflect light, are precious and valuable, are formed under intense pressure, and cannot easily be destroyed. In this same way, the soul was created to reflect the light of God. Your soul is meant to hold and reflect God's presence. Each person is born with a precious diamond within themselves. If you don't know that you have to activate it, you'll never be aware that there's anything in there for you to activate. This is a very profound implication. It means that God is not just somewhere far away or a God that's in the sky. I think that this is one of the biggest things that I really loved about reading this book, is that it really changed my perspective of God. Obviously, God is everything far beyond the universe, but I think that sometimes you think of God as this image of something that's in the sky that you're looking up to. Understanding that that diamond that we have, that soul that we have, that's actually where God is. And that it's not something that's like really far away from us, but it's something that is deep within us already. God is literally dwelling within the soul. Teresa says we cannot fully comprehend the soul. She writes that nothing can compare to the beauty and the capabilities of the soul. We cannot comprehend the soul any more than we can comprehend God Himself. The spiritual life is something that is a slow, progressive thing, and we can't necessarily think that we'll ever understand it fully. I think that every day that I seek out more knowledge, I realize just how little I know. So the soul is so mysterious. The reason for this is simple but profound. We are made in the image of God. The soul is a reflection of Him. So if you cannot fully understand God, you will never fully understand yourself either. And this realization is actually where humility begins. You are more than your circumstances. This is why St. Teresa reminds us that we cannot reduce ourselves to the surface parts of our identity. You cannot reduce yourself to your job, your trauma, your culture, your beauty, your mistakes. You are far more layered and precious than you could ever even imagine. One thing I love about how St. Teresa begins this book is that she does not start the spiritual journey by telling us that we are failures and that we are mistakes. She begins with the opposite. She begins with the truth that we do not know ourselves. She even says it is unspeakably foolish that we are so curious about our physical bodies, but almost completely ignorant about our souls. So if you think about it, we spend an enormous amount of time studying our bodies, our appearance, our clothing, our image, our aging, our health, our careers, but we rarely stop to study the diamond that is within us. We rarely ask questions like, who am I spiritually? What is my soul made for? Where does God dwell within me? When we begin to ask these deeper questions, that is where the interior journey begins. It begins the moment a person starts asking these deeper questions, the moment someone begins to look within the castle instead of only focusing on the outside world.